Oh, my friends, one of the big benefits of being on the Locked On Podcast Network is having access to some of the best minds in and around the game today. And none other than Antonio Daniels joins the show to discuss Kyrie Irving and the max extension, Kevin Durant and his responsibility around the Kyrie Irving max extension, and also expectations for veterans and rookies alike, regardless of what happens with superstar talent, how the NBA has evolved and why some young players on Brooklyn will need to step up going forward to help them get to that ultimate goal of a championship. It's a fantastic conversation, and it's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, sir. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. You know, I'm Adam Armbrecht covering also the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And without delay, as we said at the top, Antonio Daniels, NBA analyst covering the New Orleans Pelicans, former 13-year pro, right into the conversation with him, come in on the backside and break down some more of this big offseason for Brooklyn. Okay, as promised, we knew we wanted to get on a great voice from around the NBA to give us a little bit of insight, hopefully, from what's going on over the course of this Brooklyn Nets offseason. And that's why we're incredibly excited to welcome in Antonio Daniels, obviously 13-year NBA veteran, also a part of the San Antonio Spurs 1999 championship roster underneath. Someone we hope to get to maybe here, Greg Popovich, currently working for Bally Sports New Orleans, covering the Pelicans on the television analyst broadcast side, and also over on XM Sirius Radio. Antonio, thank you so much for making a little bit of time.
Oh, for sure, man. Thanks for having me, brother.
You better believe it. Now, I'd love to spend time talking about a young, exciting team like the Pelicans, but unfortunately, I have too many pressing questions around the Brooklyn Nets. Obviously, there's no other place to start than asking the question. Kyrie Irving, he's up for the max contract extension. With everything that's gone on, as someone who has experience on the player side of it and now analyzing what the league looks like today, is he still a player that is worth the max contract from the Brooklyn Nets?
Yes, he's worth the max because the max is about your skill set. Yeah, he's worth the max. But with that being said, for how many years, though? That becomes a question. Because if you're saying, okay, Kyrie Irving is worth a 2-year max contract, yep, I understand it. Kyrie Irving worth a 3-year max contract, yep, I understand it. Now, when you start getting to 4 or 5 years extension, now you have to become a little hesitant because and I don't know if you'll find anyone that's a big of a fan of Kyrie Irving's game as I am. I think he's possibly one of the most skilled players to ever touch a basketball. With all that being said, there's another side to it, though. The other side to being an NBA basketball player is availability. It's showing up. And usually if there's a question about whether a guy is a max player or not, it's not skill set based. And when we're talking about Kyrie Irving, the fact of whether or not he is a max player has nothing to do with his skill. That's the issue. It has to do with his availability or lack thereof.
And that's what we talk about on the podcast all the time is if you ask me about his game, I love him on the court as a player. It just comes down to when is he on the court and what does it look like to occupy that much cap space? Quickly, just on that, is there any world where from a player perspective, you're willing to take anything less than the maximum years and the maximum dollars? Does that enter into the thinking for players that are obviously at the top of the game? Right. Okay. I mean,
I'm going to be honest with you. I think it has to. As a player, the thing that you understand about the NBA is the intricacies of this league. Truth, reality are a lot different than fantasy. The fantasy is if I'm Kyrie Irving, I'm saying, yeah, man, I want a 5-year max contract. But reality says, do I really deserve a 5-year max contract? That's what happens. That's what this comes down to. So again, skill set, yes, you should get that. But there's a business side to this. Guys understand the business aspect of this sport. It's not just about what you do within the four lines. It's what you do outside the four lines. It's about your availability outside and inside those four lines. This was a different 2 years for Kyrie Irving. If you go back to last year in the playoffs, obviously getting injured. So you never really had an opportunity to see how that three-headed monster of Kyrie Irving, James Harden, and Kevin Durant worked out. That will be the most what-if team in the history of the NBA, possibly. Going 13-3, playing 16 games together before James Harden left, right? And now this year, with whether or not where you fall on the vaccination, choosing to get vaccinated, not choosing to get vaccinated, they're, again, fantasy and reality. Reality is if you chose not to get vaccinated, then you couldn't play when the year started. Reality was once you chose not to get vaccinated and the mandate kind of slowed down a little bit, now they basically said you can only play on the road. So that means you're only available for half the time. But this is not a Kyrie Irving problem from the last 2 years. This is an issue and a problem that has followed Kyrie Irving around for quite some time.
Yep. And it's what makes it a very difficult decision. And you understand why it feels like Brooklyn is drawing a little bit of this line in the sand. We're not willing to just automatically go forward on someone's good word, understanding there is a track record there. There's another side of this too. Recently it's come out. I want to know where you might look at Kevin Durant and his responsibility when it comes to this circumstance. But it's also tied into the way that he spoke about the coaching staff and what the coaching role is. Knowing that you played underneath Greg Popovich, someone who speaks about relationships and how important that is and managing egos and everything else that comes with being the head of a basketball team. How fine of a line is that between, yes, managing egos and then being productive on the court? And where does Kevin Durant fall in this spectrum of we have a concern? Sean Marks, Joseph Tsai are saying to Kevin Durant, we have a concern around Kyrie. Is Kevin Durant responsible to be more vocal with Kyrie Irving to say, hey, this is what's required to be a part of this? Or do off the court friendships and understanding max dollars and earning what you can get, does that override the needs of an organization?
Well, I think in this particular situation, and this comes down to a generational conversation. Yes, I played for Greg Popovich. I played for Greg Popovich in 1999 to 2002. We understand this is 20 years later. The generation, the league is a completely different league than it was at that time. There has, throughout the course of these 75 years that the NBA has existed, there's never been a more player-empowered era than what's taking place right now. Basically, what that means is the players hold a lot of the cards here. So if you are Kevin Durant and you are one of the best players to ever lace them up, right? Arguably the best player in the NBA. And you basically give an ultimatum to the Brooklyn Nets. And you're Sean Marks. How do you respond? That becomes a question. I think when we're on the outside looking in, a lot of fans look at the NBA like it's a video game, like it's 2K. There are egos that are involved. There are contracts that are involved. There are families that are involved. There is so much that's involved here. I feel like Kevin Durant needs to have a business-like approach to this. I understand the personal aspect. The reason that you came to Brooklyn was to play with Kyrie Irving. I get it. I completely understand that. But there's also a business-savvy side that you have to that. Kevin Durant is very business-savvy. He has his own production company. It's a lot that he has going on. Now, with your own production company, think about how you operate there. Would you want to pay someone top dollar amount if they were going to show up 33 to 40% of the time? Probably not. So why would you expect the Brooklyn Nets to have that same thought process or mentality? I think if all parties, Kevin Durant, Joseph Tsai, Sean Marks, Kyrie Irving, all that are involved, approach this with more of a business aspect as opposed to just the personal and relationship side, I think it could get done. Because I do feel like there's a gray area here. I don't think it's, okay, look, we are either going to sign you to a 5-year extension or we're not going to sign you at all. There is a gray area here where I think both sides can be accommodated.
And I think that sometimes that's what it should come down to from an organizational standpoint and from a player standpoint. You have to be willing to bend to maybe get that ultimate goal, which is a championship. We'll get you out the door here on this last question. When it comes to this offseason, there are a lot of veterans the Brooklyn Nets could bring back. I think chief among them might need to be Goran Dragic for what he represents as a
Mhm.
facilitator in the offensive end of this game. But also the difference from when you were playing to today, is it now this blend of youth and experience? Because it used to be have superstar talent and get veterans around them. But college players are coming out more ready than ever. Do you have to now look, if you're Brooklyn, regardless of what happens with Kyrie, and say, Day'Ron Sharp, Kessler, Edwards, Cam Thomas, you need to be a part of what we do going forward in a big way because we see how veteran bodies can break down.
So if you look at the NBA as a whole, you don't win if you're too young. You don't win if you're too old. It doesn't happen. There has to be a mixture of youth, inexperience, some naiveness with some guys that are battle tested, experienced, and guys that have been through the fire. There has to be a balance there. But you also have to rely on those young players to take the proverbial step, so to speak. The Boston Celtics are a great example. When Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown took that step, Robert Williams took that step, Grant Williams took that step. Right now, they are in the driver's seat right now to be in the NBA Finals. So yes, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Patty Mills, some of these other guys are incredibly important, but you also need those young guys that you reference to work on their game in the offseason and not come back the same players that they were this past year. That's what growing teams is all about. Because you're right, the NBA is getting a lot younger. It's getting a lot younger. When you have talent like Kevin Durant, when you have talent like Kyrie Irving, guys will want to come and play with those guys. But if by some chance you're financially strapped and you can't afford to bring in those free agents that you need to bring in, though you have to rely on that youth, that inexperience, and those guys to kind of push you over the edge. I think that's incredibly important and not discussed enough in today's NBA.
Little bit of that youthful bravado and a little bit of
Right.
naivety around how good you can be in face of how hard things might be. And that's a beautiful blend that you want to get there. Obviously, we appreciate the insights from Antonio Daniels. As we say, the time that you give us, it's well respected and regarded because we can sit here and talk about it from the outside. If you might not notice, I never played in the NBA, so I can't give the type of knowledge and information that someone like Antonio can. We appreciate you again, and thank you for your time.
For sure. Thank you.
And that, my friends, is how you have a great conversation with a former NBA player and obviously a tremendous NBA mind covering the game of basketball today. Before we dive a little bit deeper on some of the takeaways, got to remind you about our friends over at Built Bar. That's because we've been asking and Built Bar delivered. Built granola bars are, of course, here. Built granola bars come in 3 delicious flavors. You might not think that that's possible. They're unbelievable. They're all tasty. And that's because you can get chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berry. If you want to try all 3 flavors, you can, of course, grab a mixed box right now over at built.com. And these are different than the traditional bars and different from the puffs. That's because the Built granola bars are loaded with granola, as you might presume. And it's also the perfect combination of crunch and chewiness. Now you have this spectrum of flavors and textures, but they all still remain just like the bars and the puffs. Absolutely delicious, packed with protein and covered in 100% real chocolate, which is 150 calories, 15 grams of protein, and only 4 grams of sugar. Built granola bars will change your world just like they changed mine. Put your hands together, friends. Let's go for a ride with Built Bar. You know that they cracked the code on granola just like they cracked the code on all the other delicious flavors and products that they can provide for you. And you know that you can grab this on the go just like you do with all the other Built bars and have a healthy snack. Worry about expanding your exercise mind and physical fitness and not your waistline. You head over right now to built.com. Use promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off on your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. Okay. So, excellent conversation with Antonio Daniels. Want to break it down a little bit piece by piece and maybe expand the narrative that we discussed last time around the Kyrie Irving contract extension, the standstill that we may be seeing from the Brooklyn Nets and also from Kyrie Irving. The big interesting takeaway from me was, I mean, the obvious one is Kyrie Irving worth it? Of course he is. The skill set is there. The player on the court is there. But as Antonio Daniels points out, there hasn't always been availability. And the thing that I really found valuable is when you discuss the idea of, does the Brooklyn Nets need to maybe make some concessions around this, understanding how talented Kyrie Irving is? Yes, they do. But does Kyrie Irving need to come to the table with his eyes open to what has occurred since joining Brooklyn and how he needs to, beyond, as we discuss, beyond just the handshake, don't worry, I'll be there for you agreement, need to come a little bit hat in hand and say, yes, I have responsibility and ownership in this as well. Yes, he does. Both sides need to. And maybe that involves a shorter term contract. One of the interesting factors on the backside of that, though, is that it's also come out as some NBA executives, it's been reported, believe that there would be interest in a sign and trade scenario for Kyrie Irving. So, if in fact the idea of a shorter term 2-year max dollar option for the Brooklyn Nets was on the table and Kyrie really wanted the full 4 years, and there's just that you're at an impasse and Kyrie is potentially going to walk in free agency. Now, the Nets can still provide the maximum amount of money to him as his current team. So then the sign and trade scenario opens up. Now, what does that value look like, though? And do the Brooklyn Nets feel like whatever we can get back in return is going to be worth it? Now, in theory, if it's an amicable parting of ways, then anything you can get back is more valuable than nothing. But more important than probably assets in terms of draft capital would be players, right? Would be getting younger players in the door, players that also represent dollar amounts. Because if you're sending away, as we highlighted on the last episode, only so many teams could afford to take on that big dollar amount. So Brooklyn would need to find teams that can also send back cash and quality in these players. You can't just take, a bag of balls and some expiring big money contracts, right? You need quality players that you can put alongside Kevin Durant, because the other, as we know, potential bullet in that chamber would be that Kevin Durant then ultimately decides he wants to leave. So all of these things are happening there in the background, but just the idea that it's possible that teams could see a team on the doorstep, on the threshold of getting themselves to an NBA championship may look and say, listen, if we can get him in the door and in that first year you get the title, it's worth all 4 years of the contract and all the big money. Whereas from a net standpoint, as we say, in their heart of hearts, do they think that they can win the title even with bringing back Kyrie Irving? And the question, but tantalizing question, of what Ben Simmons will be if he comes back healthy. That's the big question that I think they have to ask themselves and probably are asking themselves. The other piece that we also touched on was Kevin Durant. What is his role? We all understand the value of, if you're on the East Coast, the West Coast, there's benefits, the exposure beyond the court, building your brand as so many athletes want to do, rightfully so. I'm covering Kayvon Thibodeau over on the Giants podcast. That dude has a brand. He wants to grow it. He wanted to be in New York. But he also has said in interviews, I know that it starts with what I do on the field. If I'm productive and successful on the field, everything else will come from there. Now, it's a little bit different when we talk about Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving, guys that are already well established. But does Joe Tsai and Sean Marks have the ability, as I'm sure they probably discussed when they brought them in, when they brought in Kevin Durant? Hey, you can build your brand further in Brooklyn, on the East Coast, in New York. Can they go to him now and say, you get it? It's also a business. There's more here than just saying this kid is an elite talent, you're buddies with him, and we'll just live with it. If he comes, he goes, whatever the case may be. I think you can have those conversations, but I don't know if that moves the needle for Kevin Durant. I think either he is comfortable with the organization making the choices that he needs to, or he just believes that this is the player that I came here to play with. Kyrie Irving signed and got me here, so he can't go. Or if he goes, I will go as well. But it was fun to kind of flesh a little bit of that out with Antonio. And we even kind of mentioned a little bit about the coaching piece of it, right? How what does that tandem look like there when we're discussing that side of the roster, that side of the team chemistry? Um, and I really would have liked to have been able to pick his brain a little bit deeper on the balance, but he touched on 20 years ago and what it looked like to play under Greg Popovich is not the way it looks today. In a positive way, players have more control over where they go and how they get paid and what they're capable of doing and how they can use their voice. And all those things are incredibly positive. But it did make me wonder what personalities 20 years ago maybe would act a little bit differently or carry themselves a little bit differently if they played in the NBA today. And that's something maybe you have to deal with as much of. Greg Popovich is still, obviously, he's the GOAT, one of the best to ever do it at the coaching level. And he's always struck this balance of being incredibly vigorous in the way that he coaches and also incredibly convicted in the way that he supports, loves, and builds relationships with the players on his team. Could he start today as an NBA coach and still have that level of success? Almost certainly. Those relationships, we know the Kawhi Leonard deteriorated around the injury management, etc. It seems like Spoelstra kind of has that same mentality. So ultimately, it's the marriage of attitude, execution, and success. If you're a good, well-run organization, then you can set the standard and have players want to come be a part of that and be on board with it. And maybe that's a little bit of what Sean Marks was speaking to when he tried to reassert what they want the culture and what they want the foundation of this franchise to be. They haven't had the success that a lot of these other franchises have had. Steve Nash obviously hasn't had the success that a lot of these other coaches have had. But you got to start somewhere. And if you find yourself always wavering on whatever those cornerstone principles were, then every 3-4 years, you can find yourself at the mercy of a particular player or just of decisions, difficult decisions that you have to make. We will come right back in here in a second and break down the other piece that we talked about there, the rookies, the veterans, expectations for them as well. But we got to just remind you real quick here. We know that you make the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen of the day. But why don't you make the second listen of the day, the Locked On NBA Big Board? You know it's going to be host Rafael Barlow from the NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter. He's joined by Richard Stayman, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin, and gives fans a deep, in-depth dive look at the NBA draft, mock drafts, player rankings, and of course, big boards. Will there be a pick at 23 for the Brooklyn Nets, or will they go ahead and push it off? He's going to have you all covered. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. Okay, so the other piece then was the way, again, that things have changed from 20 years ago to today. I think now, and Antonio spoke to this, you always need experience, but you don't want to be too old. You always need youth, but you can't just be young across the board. And this is where I think we touched on Dragic there a little bit, and we'll flesh this out. Doug and I will come back in next week and talk even a little bit more about Bruce Brown. Where does his contract potentially lie? Unrestricted free agent. What are the Nets going to do there? And then all of these other players. Recently, it came out that LaMarcus Aldridge could be exploring playing overseas to continue his professional career. So, is Marcus Aldridge going to be back or not? Just take him off the table. He didn't play down the stretch. Blake Griffin, is he going to be back? I think there's still value there. I touched on Goran Dragic because, with Kyrie, without Kyrie, either way, assume everyone's back together here. Goran Dragic is a critical piece and probably a critical piece that you can get at a friendly dollar amount, most importantly. To say nothing of the conversation that Doug had earlier in the week around Nicholas Claxton and him being worth the $35 million on a 3-year deal as well. But all of these things, at the end of the day, you're going to need Kessler Edwards to not only do, obviously, to build on what he did this past season, but then get more consistent. He's got to become a legitimate, probably not only perimeter threat, as we saw him knock down some shots from the outside with consistency at times. And listen, rookie growth, some things to obviously develop and work on. But he's got to be a guy that gets it done in the mid-range as well, right? He needs to start to become a multiple level scorer. And you saw some little flashes of it along the way. Got to get elite, got to get better, got to work on the game. Cam Thomas, you got to find a way. You're small. You got to find a way to be tenacious defensively, be a pest on that end of the floor. And then offensively, you have to continue, as he did start to show, that you have the ability to make the right basketball play, to involve everyone, to utilize your superstar talent, and then also know, because you can be a 3-level scorer. First of all, start doing that with consistency. And then you need to know when you need to cook. You need to start to take a bigger step into that role. And then the last piece, obviously, is going to be Day'Ron Sharpe. I know that Doug and I batted it around a little bit. The more that I think about it, now, potentially, if you know automatically that Marcus isn't going to be coming back, I wasn't really holding my breath on him to begin with, but something that Doug and I will debate more next week is I don't know if Andre Drummond need be brought back. And it's not because there isn't the role and the value there. I think, and we've discussed it before, but I look at it now as if you're going to commit to, as we think they should, Nicholas Claxton, and you know that Ben Simmons is going to be there, At that point, when you're talking about the center position and then the complement of pieces on this roster, Day'Ron Sharpe, get better, get bigger, get stronger, get more effective, right? Be more efficient, stop fouling, grow from that, and then also show that you're capable of having a little bit of a shot. He did show that at the college level, and I think that he's capable of doing it at the pros, and he probably just needed more time to get that done. Whether or not he should have spent the entire year down in the G League working on it, or they should have just thrown him into the water, the deep end a little bit sooner and then just stuck with him, maybe. But the bottom line is, I probably move forward with Day'Ron and say, take the next step forward. Doesn't mean you're going to be, you don't have to be the fifth best player on the team next season, but you can do the role that Andre Drummond does. And then you open up some veteran money, maybe to go pursue someone else, another shooter or another quality defender, even we talk about in pursuit of the elusive 3-and-D wings. That's probably where I stand here on a Friday night. That's where I think that the Nets should look to go on a Friday morning, depending on when you listen to the podcast. But I agree with Antonio that you can't rest on the idea of, as long as we have the superstars, everything else will work out. We have too many sample sizes of it not working out with the superstars, let alone with other players, right? And I mentioned it with Antonio there. Some of the value is in what the young players don't know, right? They don't know that they shouldn't be able to take on assignment X or player X, and they do it anyway, right? Cam Thomas doesn't know that he shouldn't be able to drop 50 at MSG, but he does it anyway, right? Those are the things that I think matter, a little bit of that bravado. Now, the other benefit off of that is that you can turn around. Remember, we were saying about how, if the Nets want to make any moves, the big money of Joe Harris, or try to use some of the trade exemptions, but you have to either attach a pick or potentially a player. Well, Cam Thomas, Kessler Edwards, Day'Ron Sharpe, none of them are at the point yet where they are as attractive of an asset as they potentially can be. So phase one for the Brooklyn Nets is going to be having these guys get better in the short term because it helps the team. And then in the long term, you can continue to make decisions about who is the true core going forward here in and around Kevin Durant and Kyrie and Ben, or after them, beyond them, right? You still need to identify if these are guys that fit your long-term plans as young players, or players that you want to maximize what their value is right now so that you can turn them into asset X, to player X, to draft pick X down the road, 1 or 2 years from now. So that's still an avenue too, but they still have to develop and get better in that vein. It'll be interesting to see how some of these decisions get made, and we'll grind it down to a bit of a into dust over the next couple of weeks. I think Doug and I will get on together and discuss some of these big decisions that they need to make. It'll be fascinating. I I don't know what the path forward is necessarily going to look like for Brooklyn, but right now, Sean Marks and the Nets need to be seeing the success that can exist with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and Ben Simmons, with Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons, maybe with Ben Simmons. And that's something that we'll discuss next week. If the dominoes were to fall, that Kyrie Irving only wants the max years and the max dollars, and he's gone by sign and trade or outright walking into free agency, and that potentially initiates Kevin Durant's ultimate exit from the team, whether immediately or a year from now or at the deadline, seeing how the season may start. Is Ben Simmons a young enough player right now? And can he be talented enough not to be the anchor and the ultimate player, but can he be your locked in number two as you start to rebuild the thing around him, rebuild the organization around him, reassess? I mean, listen, as the Christian Winfield article suggested, boy, if it all falls apart, the Nets are plummeting down to the bottom of the Eastern Conference. And that obviously would be a reality that they would have to face. But can you successfully navigate these waters after having waded into them? You think with eyes wide open about the risks and about the potential rewards. And maybe now you see yourself reaching your feet and not being able to quite touch the bottom. And now you're looking at, how do we get a couple of rocks underneath our feet? How do we stabilize ourselves so that we can stay in the deep playoff waters, or in the playoff waters, period, without feeling like the current could come and sweep us under again at any moment. It's a fascinating discussion. I mean, this is one I love. And by the way, as we'll wrap it up here and get out the door, and we remind you to go over to YouTube, get the podcast. Obviously, we get those needs fulfilled. Subscribe, get into the chat. Yesterday's episode was phenomenal. Everyone everybody in the comments just talking about the different, obviously, mechanics, the different decisions the Nets can make, and then you were complimentary towards me, and I genuinely appreciate it. I try, Doug and I both try to be analytical, to be thoughtful around the way we look at this team and the circumstances. And hopefully this is another one of those episodes for you. The conversation with Antonio Daniels was an absolute pleasure to have. And that's what we want to continue doing this offseason. Have thoughtful conversations around how Brooklyn navigates whatever comes next. That's the only way you can really frame it. I say this every time. Without Doug Norrie, there is no quote, only to say, I miss my friend and I want to get him back on here soon. And of course, that we will be back again next time talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.